He ruled with fear, paranoia, and a thirst for blood. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo transformed the Philadelphia mob into one of the most violent crime families in American history. This in-depth, cinematic true crime documentary traces Scarfo's rise from a volatile enforcer to a paranoid mafia dictator. From murder contracts and mob wars to betrayal, family ties, and ultimate downfall, this is the full story of the most dangerous boss the American Mafia ever produced. Before we begin, a crucial disclaimer. This entire narrative has been meticulously compiled from a wide array of verified historical sources, court transcripts, FBI files, and first-hand accounts. Our sole purpose is to present you with the most accurate and comprehensive information possible. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is the raw, unfiltered chronicle of a man who believed he was above the law, a man who bathed an entire city in red. If you are ready for a journey into the heart of darkness, into a world where loyalty was bought with blood and paranoia was the only currency, then do not look away. Stay with us until the very end, because the full, shocking truth of Little Nicky Scarfo is more terrifying than any nightmare. Please, if you appreciate deep-dive true crime stories told with respect for the facts, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It supports our channel and allows us to bring these crucial, often untold, histories to light. The story of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo begins not with a bang, but in the quiet, almost mundane setting of a traditional Italian-American household in Brooklyn, 1929. His birth, however, was a portent of the volatility to come, coinciding with the violent crescendo of the Castellammarere War, the bloody conflict that would reshape the American Mafia. While other infants were soothed by lullabies, Scarfo's earliest years were subconsciously scored by the distant echoes of gangland shootings and the whispered anxieties of a community living under the shadow of organized crime. This was not an environment that bred gentle men. When Scarfo was still a boy, his family made the pivotal decision to leave Brooklyn for the slightly less chaotic, but no less mob-influenced, streets of South Philadelphia. It was here, in the crowded row houses and tight-knit neighborhoods of the Italian market district, that the boy's true education began. The classroom was the street corner. The teachers were local wise guys who wore their success in the cut of their suits and the deference they commanded. The curriculum was intimidation, opportunity, and the unspoken laws of omerta. Young Nicodemo was a diminutive figure, a fact that would later fuel both his nickname and a ferocious, compensatory rage. He stood just over 5'5", a small stature that in the jungle of South Philly could have been a death sentence. But Scarfo turned it into a weapon. He learned quickly that to survive, let alone thrive, he had to be harder, faster, and infinitely more ruthless than anyone who looked down on him. His temper became legendary even in his teens, a lightning-fast, uncontrollable fury that could erupt over a perceived slight or a wrong glance. This wasn't the calculated anger of a strategist. It was the pure, psychopathic rage of a predator who refused to ever be prey. He didn't seek to win arguments. He sought to obliterate opposition. This raw, vicious potential did not go unnoticed. The Philadelphia crime family, then under the steady, more pragmatic rule of boss Angelo Bruno, was a functioning arm of the National Commission. Bruno, known as the Gentle Don or the Docile Don, preferred quiet profitability over loud violence. Racketeering, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and union control were the engines of the family, and murder, while sometimes necessary, was a last resort, a messy business to be avoided. Into this ecosystem of relative calm swam the piranha that was Nicky Scarfo. He was not a thinker, not a negotiator. He was a natural-born enforcer, a soldato whose sole and undeniable value was his willingness to do the thing others hesitated to do. He found his mentor and patron in a man who shared his appetite for violence, Philip Chicken Man Testa. Testa, a Bruno loyalist but himself a volatile character, saw in Scarfo a kindred spirit, a perfect instrument of fear. Under Testa's wing, Scarfo's education became practical, hands-on. He graduated from street corner intimidation to collections, to strong-arm tactics, and finally, to the sacred, terrible rite of the mafia, murder. His first known killing, a brutal and undisputed act of loyalty, was the grim baptism that fully welcomed him into the life. It announced to the Philadelphia underworld that this little man carried an enormous, unforgiving shadow. While Bruno ruled from a distance, preferring the subtle levers of power, Scarfo and Testa operated in the gritty trenches, their reputations built on a foundation of fear. Scarfo's base of operations, however, would shift dramatically in the late 1950s. After a serious altercation, a stabbing that underscored his hair-trigger temper, Scarfo made a strategic, or perhaps exilic, move. He relocated to Atlantic City, New Jersey. At the time, this was seen as a backwater, a sleepy seaside resort town past its prime, a kind of mafia purgatory. For the ambitious wise guys in Philadelphia, it was a sidelining. But for Scarfo, Atlantic City became something else entirely. A personal kingdom, a laboratory for his methods, and a fortress. Here, he was no longer just a small soldier in a big army. He was the undisputed top dog in a small pond. He consolidated control over the city's dwindling rackets with terrifying efficiency. He owned the bars, the vending machines, the numbers games. More importantly, he owned the politicians, the police, and the city's soul. His headquarters was a restaurant called Scarf Incorporated, a bland name for a nerve center of corruption. It was here he held court, dispensing orders and judgments with the imperiousness of a Roman emperor. His rule in Atlantic City was absolute and enforced through sheer, unadulterated terror. He cultivated a crew of loyalists, men like his nephew Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti and Lawrence Yogi Molino, who were mirrors of his own viciousness. In this insulated world, Scarfo's paranoia, always a latent trait, began to germinate and flourish. He saw disloyalty in every question, betrayal in every hesitation. The seeds of the dictator were sown in the sands of Atlantic City. He created a world where a wrong word, a missed payment, or even a lack of enthusiastic deference could be a capital offense. This was the calm before the cataclysmic storm, the period where little Nicky, free from the restraining influence of Philadelphia's old guard, perfected his philosophy of rule by bloodshed, waiting for the moment his small kingdom would become the blueprint for an entire crime family's descent into hell. The peaceful, almost dormant kingdom Nicky Scarfo built in Atlantic City would not remain a quiet backwater for long. A seismic shift in the American legal landscape was about to catapult his fiefdom into the center of a financial hurricane, and with it, Scarfo's ambitions would metastasize from local terror to a national criminal enterprise. That shift was the legalization of casino gambling in New Jersey in 1976. Atlantic City was to be reborn, not as a family-friendly resort, but as the Las Vegas of the East Coast. For the traditional mafia, this was the opportunity of a century, a literal gold rush of cash, construction, and concession rackets. And Nicky Scarfo, the vicious little warlord who already controlled the streets, was perfectly, poisonously positioned. He saw not just opportunity, but destiny. He would be the gatekeeper, the shadow mayor, the man behind the glittering new skyline. The influx of billions in construction money was a tidal wave of potential skim. The casino unions were ripe for infiltration and control. The garbage hauling, the linen supply, the food and beverage deliveries, every facet of this new machine could be corrupted, taxed, and owned. Scarfo and his crew descended upon this bonanza with the subtlety of a pack of wolves. They muscled in on concrete contracts, using threats of violence and work stoppages to extort millions from developers. They placed their associates in key union positions to control labor and orchestrate sweetheart deals. They strong-armed their way into the lucrative junket business, controlling the flow of high rollers from Philadelphia and New York, earning kickbacks and marking anyone who operated independently for punishment. But this golden opportunity also exposed the fatal flaw in Scarfo's psychology, the crack that would eventually swallow his entire empire. Where a more strategic boss like the late Angelo Bruno would have sought stable, long-term corruption, focusing on quiet, sustainable profit, Scarfo saw only immediate dominance enforced by maximum brutality. The immense pressure and visibility of the casino world did not temper him. It amplified his worst instincts. He was no longer just settling scores in dark alleys. He was now authorizing hits on contractors in hotel parking lots and ordering the murders of union officials who showed a hint of independence. The body count began to rise, not in the shadows, but in the bright, new light of the reborn city. This period also marked Scarfo's bloody and chaotic ascent to the very top of the Philadelphia family. For years, the gentle Don, Angelo Bruno, had maintained a fragile peace. But on March 21, 1980, that peace was shattered forever. Bruno was assassinated, shot in the head while sitting in a car in South Philadelphia. The hit, orchestrated by underboss Philip Testa and New York's Gambino family, who were frustrated with Bruno's resistance to the heroin trade and his hoarding of Atlantic City's riches, unleashed a whirlwind. Testa briefly took the throne, but his reign was measured in months. In March 1981, he was blown to pieces by a nail bomb rigged to the porch of his home. The Philadelphia family was now leaderless, adrift in a sea of paranoia and suspicion, a state of anarchy that was a perfect breeding ground for a strongman. In the ensuing power vacuum, a figure named Nicodemo Nicky Scarfo, the fierce and feared ruler of Atlantic City, saw his opening. He was not the senior statesman. Other, older capos had more historical claim. But Scarfo had something far more compelling in this new climate of fear: an unwavering, demonstrated capacity for unlimited violence and a cadre of young, fanatically loyal killers who answered only to him. He maneuvered ruthlessly, leveraging his connections on the commission, particularly with the powerful Gambino boss, Paul Castellano, who saw in Scarfo a controllable, violent proxy. By the summer of 1981, through a combination of external backing and internal terror, Nicodemo Scarfo was declared the new boss of the Philadelphia South Jersey crime family. The era of the gentle Don was not just over, it was being systematically erased. Scarfo immediately instituted a reign of terror that would make the previous decades look tranquil. He moved his base of operations from Atlantic City to a narrow, unassuming social club at 923 South 9th Street in Philadelphia, which he nicknamed the Candy Store. This cramped, smoke-filled room became the epicenter of a paranoid dictatorship. Here, surrounded by his nephew Philip Leonetti, his consigliere Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi, and other loyalists, Scarfo conducted the daily business of the family, which was now almost exclusively murder. Meetings were not strategy sessions, they were royal courts where life and death decisions were made on a whim. Scarfo's management style was a toxic cocktail of megalomania and intense, crippling paranoia. He demanded absolute, slavish devotion. He instituted a rule that no member could look directly at him, forcing them to stare at the floor or the wall in his presence, a literal manifestation of his need to dominate and his fear of betrayal. He required his men to kiss him on the cheek as a sign of loyalty, a grotesque parody of affection that was in fact a test of submission. He saw enemies everywhere, his mind constantly weaving elaborate webs of conspiracy from the threads of minor slights or imagined disrespect. A missed phone call, a perceived coldness in tone, a joke that didn't land, any of these could be interpreted as a capital offense. The family's revenue streams, the casinos, the loan sharking, the extortion, became almost secondary. The primary product was fear, and the primary activity was murder to sustain that fear. The once profitable and relatively stable Bruno Testa operation was transformed overnight into a killing machine with Scarfo as its unhinged architect. He was not building an empire, he was conducting a purge, and the list of targets grew longer by the day, a grim ledger written in blood that would soon include his most trusted allies and, ultimately, himself. With the crown of the Philadelphia family now perched uneasily upon his head, Nicky Scarfo did not seek to consolidate his power through diplomacy or the careful distribution of wealth. Instead, he initiated a reign of blood so prolific and so senseless that it would ultimately become his own undoing, transforming the once cohesive criminal organization into a slaughterhouse where the only constant was the boss's bottomless suspicion. The social club on 9th Street, the Candy Store, ceased to be a place of business and became a throne room of paranoia, where Scarfo, surrounded by his sycophants, would decree death sentences with the casual cruelty of a man ordering lunch. His nephew and underboss, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, and his consigliere, Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi, became the chief instruments of this terror, their loyalty enforced by fear and familial bond. But even those bonds would eventually strain and snap under the weight of Scarfo's insanity. The first major test of his brutal new order came swiftly. Salvie Testa, the handsome, charismatic, and highly popular son of the murdered boss Philip Testa, was seen as a natural leader. He was young, intelligent, and commanded genuine respect from the soldiers, a stark contrast to Scarfo's rule by terror. For Scarfo, respect that was not born of fear was a direct threat. He began to see Salvie not as a valuable asset, but as a rival, a potential focal point for dissent. The young man's very existence became an insult to Scarfo's authority. Without any evidence of betrayal, based solely on jealous paranoia and the poisonous whispers of other jealous capos, Scarfo condemned Salvie Testa to death. The order was a shock to the system. Killing the beloved son of a former boss, a made man with no tangible disloyalty, was a violation of the mob's own corroded code. It sent a clear, chilling message: under Scarfo, no one was safe, popularity was a death sentence, and the boss's whim was the only law. In October 1984, Salvie Testa was lured to a meeting and gunned down outside a South Philadelphia candy store, a hit that haunted the family and planted the first, deep seeds of disillusionment and fear even among Scarfo's inner circle. But the killing did not quell Scarfo's anxieties, it fed them. Each execution seemed to create two new perceived enemies in his mind. He turned on his own with a ferocity usually reserved for outsiders. When a loyal soldier named Frank "Chicky" Nerduxi expressed a desire to move to Florida to escape the escalating violence, Scarfo interpreted this not as a man seeking peace for his family, but as a desertion, a betrayal. Nerduxi was marked. When he was shot dead, it was another lesson. Loyalty was not a contract you could retire from. It was a life sentence with only one form of parole. The violence became indiscriminate, almost recreational. A former ally named Pat Spirito made the fatal mistake of independently hijacking a truck containing linen meant for an Atlantic City casino, a Scarfo-controlled racket. For this act of freelance greed, Spirito was summoned, chastised, and then, as he left the meeting believing he'd been forgiven, he was shot in the back of the head on Scarfo's direct orders. The message was clear: all money flowed to Scarfo, and any deviation was a capital crime. The atmosphere within the family descended into a gothic horror of mutual suspicion. Men would arrive at meetings not knowing if they were there to plan a murder or be the subject of one. Scarfo's paranoia extended to the most mundane interactions. He believed in omens and superstitions with a medieval fervor. If a bird flew into a window, it was a sign of betrayal. If someone spilled salt, it foretold death. His men lived in a constant state of psychological torture, forced to navigate not only the dangers of their criminal enterprises but the labyrinthine and unpredictable pathologies of their boss's mind. This internal terror was mirrored by an external war. Scarfo's violent takeover and his flagrant expansion into Atlantic City had angered the New York families, particularly the Genovese, who felt their interests were being trampled. A simmering conflict erupted into open warfare. Hits were ordered and reciprocated in a dizzying spiral. Scarfo capos were gunned down in drive-by shootings. New York associates were found dead in parking lots. The streets of Philadelphia and Atlantic City became a free-fire zone, with bystanders increasingly at risk. The sheer volume of violence, over 24 murders directly linked to Scarfo's brief reign, was unprecedented. It shattered the mafia's crucial veil of secrecy and brought a level of law enforcement scrutiny that the traditionally low-profile Philadelphia family had never experienced. The FBI, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement turned their full attention to the little man in the finely tailored suits who was leaving a trail of corpses across 2 states. Where Angelo Bruno had operated in the shadows, Scarfo was creating a spectacle of carnage. He was not just breaking the law, he was performing it as a grand, bloody tragedy, and every new act drew the spotlight closer. The money, the raison d'etre of organized crime, began to dry up as legitimate businesses grew too terrified to deal with Scarfo's unstable regime, and as the mob's energies were diverted from profit to pure survival. The family was bleeding out, both literally and financially, and at the center of it all stood Nicky Scarfo, convinced with every passing death that he was cementing his legacy, utterly blind to the fact that he was methodically building his own tomb with every body he dropped. The fear he cultivated so assiduously was no longer a tool, it was a prison, and the walls were closing in on him and everyone he commanded. The turning point, the moment when the house of cards Nicky Scarfo had built from fear and blood began its irreversible collapse, did not come from a rival's bullet or a police raid, but from within the very heart of his paranoid kingdom. The catalyst was not a grand betrayal, but the inevitable consequence of a system where loyalty was enforced at gunpoint and every man lived under a suspended death sentence. As the bodies of friends and associates piled up, Salvie Testa, Frank Nerduxi, Pat Spirito, and countless others, the psychological burden on Scarfo's inner circle became unbearable. The men who had once been his most trusted executioners, his nephew Philip Leonetti and his consigliere Nicholas Caramandi, began to experience a chilling calculus of survival. They saw the pattern. Today's confidant was tomorrow's suspect. The murder of Salvie Testa had been a profound shock, a crack in the foundation. The killing of Rocco Marinucci, a loyal soldier whose only crime was being suspected of talking too loosely, widened that crack into a chasm. Marinucci was lured to his death with the promise of a reconciliation, only to be strangled and stabbed, a messy, intimate killing that underscored the depravity of Scarfo's rule. For Leonetti and Caramandi, who were involved in or aware of every killing, a horrifying realization dawned. In Scarfo's world, there were no veterans, no retired statesmen. There were only active participants and dead men. The boss's paranoia was a cancer with an endless appetite, and eventually, it would consume them too. This dread was compounded by the relentless, suffocating pressure from law enforcement. The FBI, led by determined agents who had been meticulously building cases, began to close the net. They used every tool at their disposal: wiretaps on social clubs and payphones, surveillance teams that became a constant shadow, and the leverage of the newly enacted Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute. This law was a nightmare for men like Scarfo. It allowed prosecutors to tie together a pattern of criminal acts over years and charge the entire enterprise as a continuing criminal conspiracy. A single murder could put you away for life, but RICO could bury the entire hierarchy of a crime family under decades of prison time. The pressure became palpable. Arrests were no longer for minor charges. They were major indictments with terrifying potential sentences. The walls of the candy store felt less like a fortress and more like a cage with the walls contracting. It was in this pressure cooker of internal terror and external pursuit that the foundation of Scarfo's power, the Code of Omerta, finally crumbled. The first major defection was not from a weak link, but from a pillar, Nicholas "Nicky Crow" Caramandi. Facing a lengthy prison sentence for racketeering, and knowing with absolute certainty that Scarfo would order his murder from behind bars to prevent any possibility of cooperation, Caramandi made the once unthinkable choice. He broke the sacred oath of silence and became a government witness. His decision was not born of sudden morality, but of cold, logical survival. He had seen the blueprint of his own future in the corpses of his friends. Caramandi's defection in 1986 was an earthquake. He was not a low-level soldier. He was the consigliere, the advisor, the man who had been in the room for nearly every significant conversation, every murder plot, every financial scheme. He could provide the roadmap to Scarfo's entire empire of crime. He could detail the murders, the extortions, the inner workings of the Atlantic City casino skims. His testimony would be catastrophic, and Scarfo knew it. The boss's response, from his jail cell where he was now often held on pre-trial detention, was predictably homicidal: order the murder of Caramandi's entire family. But it was too late. They were in witness protection. The family was now hemorrhaging credibility and control. The unthinkable then became a tidal wave. Philip "Crazy Phil" Leonetti, the underboss, the favorite nephew, the prince to Scarfo's bloody throne, faced his own moment of truth. After his arrest on RICO charges, facing the reality of life in prison and reflecting on the monstrous path his uncle had led him down, a path littered with bodies of men he once called friends, Leonetti made the same calculation. The bond of blood was severed by the stronger instinct of self-preservation and a dawning, horrific understanding of the legacy he was leaving for his own son. In 1989, Philip Leonetti, the most feared enforcer in the Philadelphia mob, did what Salvie Testa or Frank Nerduxi never had the chance to do: he walked away. But he didn't just disappear. He, too, chose to cooperate. His testimony was the coup de grace. If Caramandi provided the roadmap, Leonetti provided the soul-searing confession, the intimate portrait of the monster from within the monster's lair. He could testify to Scarfo's direct orders, his moods, his irrational rages, his chilling calm while discussing murder. The defection of his nephew was a psychological blow from which Scarfo could never recover. It was the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that his philosophy of rule had created nothing but enemies, even in his own mirror image. Other soldiers and associates, seeing the highest levels of the family turning state's evidence, began to follow suit in a desperate scramble for leniency. The floodgates were open. The once impenetrable wall of silence was now a sieve, and through it poured the entire horrifying story of Scarfo's reign. The FBI and prosecutors now had a chorus of voices, a symphony of corroboration that painted an incontrovertible picture of a criminal enterprise run as a psychopath's personal playground. The trials that followed were not mere legal proceedings. They were the public autopsy of the Philadelphia Mafia. Scarfo, along with many of his remaining loyalists, was convicted on a staggering array of charges, including multiple counts of murder and racketeering. In 1988, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 55 years, a sentence that was less a judicial ruling and more a symbolic entombment. The man who believed he was a king, an untouchable dictator, was reduced to a number in a federal penitentiary, his empire evaporated, his legacy one of unparalleled ruin. The violence had not cemented his power, it had sown the seeds of its own destruction, creating the very witnesses who would ensure he died behind bars. The conviction and life sentence of Nicodemo Scarfo did not mark the end of his story, but rather its grim, convoluted evolution from a tale of street-level tyranny to a darker, more pathetic saga of a man utterly consumed by the very pathologies that once fueled his rise. Prison, for most inmates, is a place of deprivation and reflection, a forced halt to a life of action. For Scarfo, it became a perverse, shrunken stage where he could continue to perform his role as boss, but now to an audience of fellow convicts, corrupt guards, and the ever-listening microphones of the state. Stripped of his fine suits and the tangible power of life and death over a city, his weaponized paranoia now had no external outlet and thus turned entirely inward, curdling into a self-destructive obsession that would ultimately ensnare his own flesh and blood. The federal penitentiary system, with its rigid hierarchies and culture of snitches and stand-up guys, was a distorted mirror of the world he had ruled. Here, Scarfo attempted to maintain his aura of authority, holding court in the prison yard or during phone calls, still issuing commands through a dwindling network of contacts on the outside. But the commands were now the echoes of a ghost, impotent and often intercepted. Law enforcement, knowing Scarfo's nature, worked tirelessly to ensure he remained a potent source of his own incrimination. They monitored his communications with a precision he never anticipated, understanding that a man who lived by the spoken order would die by the recorded word. This external pressure was matched by an internal, familial pressure that would define his final decades. Scarfo had a son, Nicodemo S. Nicky Jr. Scarfo, who had grown up in the long, dark shadow of his father's infamy. Unlike his father, Nicky Jr. was not a street thug. He was more polished, better educated, and initially seemed to steer toward legitimate business. He went into the financial sector, a world far removed from the social clubs of South Philadelphia. But the pull of the name, the weight of the legacy, and perhaps the twisted desire for his father's approval, proved too strong. Nicky Jr. became involved in the business, though he operated with a different style, one that attempted to marry his father's ruthless ambition with the sleek tools of modern finance. This dynamic, the imprisoned, aging dinosaur and his son navigating the outside world, created a fatal tension. The old man, from his cell, could not relinquish control. He was consumed with the idea of his son not just succeeding him, but vindicating him, restoring the Scarfo name to its feared prominence. His advice, however, was not the strategic wisdom of a retired don. It was the paranoid, anachronistic ramblings of a man frozen in 1985. He saw betrayal in every business partner, he insisted on outdated methods of intimidation, and he viewed the legitimate financial world with the same suspicion he held for rival mobsters. This toxic guidance would set his son on a collision course with disaster. Meanwhile, the authorities were far from finished with the Scarfo name. They watched Nicky Jr. with intense interest, understanding that the son's activities could be the key to keeping the father locked away forever, or even adding new charges. The focus shifted from the violent rackets of the 1980s to complex financial crimes, a new frontier where the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission worked in tandem. The investigation zeroed in on a shocking and audacious scheme that seemed to blend the old-world muscle of the mob with the white-collar fraud of the new century. The hostile takeover of First Plus Financial Group, a Texas-based mortgage company. Prosecutors would later allege that Nicky Jr., along with a group of associates that included lawyers and financiers, orchestrated a sophisticated plot to loot the company of millions. The scheme involved using mob threats and intimidation, orchestrated with the blessing and strategic input of the imprisoned Scarfo Sr., to gain control of the company's board, then systematically draining its assets through fraudulent consulting fees and acquisitions. It was a brazen plan, a direct injection of organized crime into the heart of Wall Street, and it was conducted with the arrogant belief that the old rules of evidence no longer applied in the complex world of high finance. What the Scarfos did not comprehend was that their every move was being documented. Nicky Jr., believing himself smarter than his father's generation, failed to grasp the omnipresent surveillance of the digital age. He visited his father in prison, their conversations recorded. He used intermediaries who were, themselves, cooperating with the government. He left a paper trail of emails and financial transactions that formed a perfect map of the conspiracy. The father and son, separated by prison walls, were collaboratively weaving the rope that would hang them both, their communication a steady stream of incriminating evidence that federal prosecutors meticulously collected. In 2011, the hammer fell in a way that must have felt like a grotesque echo to the elder Scarfo. He was indicted, alongside his son and several others, for racketeering, conspiracy, securities fraud, and wire fraud. The charges outlined a narrative that seemed ripped from a movie, the aging mob boss directing a multi-million-dollar financial heist from a prison cell. For Scarfo Sr., now in his 80s and already serving a life sentence, the new indictment was a metaphysical defeat. It proved that his reach, though diminished, was still considered dangerous, and more importantly, it ensured he would never draw a free breath. For Nicky Jr., it was the catastrophic end of his attempt to modernize the family business. The trial was another spectacle, showcasing how the methods of the Philadelphia mob had evolved, yet how the core weaknesses, greed, arrogance, and a fatal inability to adapt to a world of total surveillance, remained unchanged. In 2015, both Scarfos were convicted. Nicky Jr. was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His father, already buried under a mountain of time, received an additional sentence, a purely symbolic addition that served as the final, official seal on his legacy. Not as a feared legend, but as a perpetual inmate, a cautionary tale who had managed to extend his ruin across generations, ensuring that his bloodline would continue his sentence long after his own heart had stopped beating. To understand the full, chilling resonance of Nicky Scarfo's legacy, one must look beyond the ledger of his murders and the specifics of his financial schemes, and instead examine the profound and lasting decertification he inflicted upon the landscape of the American Mafia itself. His reign was not merely a violent chapter, it was a controlled detonation that left the Philadelphia crime family a hollow, irradiated shell, a cautionary monument to the consequences of unhinged leadership. Where once stood an organization of quiet power and deep-rooted influence, a machine that had operated for decades with a sinister efficiency, Scarfo left only scorched earth and shattered lives. The true cost of his paranoia was measured not just in the bodies he ordered to the grave, but in the systemic annihilation of trust, tradition, and sustainable criminal enterprise. The Philadelphia family, under the stewardship of men like Bruno, had been a pillar of the National Commission, a respected entity that generated immense wealth through a network of corruption that was, in its own twisted way, stable and predictable. It was a business, albeit a monstrous one. Scarfo, in less than a decade, transformed it into a cult of personality centered on a psychopath, where the primary business was murdering its own members. He did not just kill his rivals, he exterminated the family's future by eliminating an entire generation of capable leaders. Men like Salvie Testa, who possessed the charisma and intelligence to guide the organization, and by traumatizing the survivors into becoming government witnesses. The code of omerta, the sacred wall of silence that had protected La Cosa Nostra for generations, was not just breached under Scarfo. It was systematically dismantled brick by the very men who had sworn to uphold it. The defections of Nicholas Caramandi and Philip Leonetti did not happen in a vacuum. They were the direct, logical outcome of a system where loyalty was rewarded with a death sentence. Scarfo created an environment where flipping to the government was not an act of betrayal, but the only rational act of survival. He turned his most trusted lieutenants into his most devastating prosecutors, thereby inventing a new and devastating precedent, that the highest levels of a crime family could be converted into a chorus of informants. This legacy of internal betrayal would haunt every American Mafia family for decades to come, making every boss suspicious of his underlings and chilling the willingness to commit acts that could lead to life in prison. The organizational knowledge that was lost was irreplaceable, but more importantly, the psychological contract was destroyed. Why live by a code that your own boss does not respect? Why remain silent when silence only earns you a bullet in the back of the head? Scarfo answered these questions for his men, and his answer led them straight into the arms of the FBI. Beyond the human wreckage, there was the financial devastation. The lucrative Atlantic City rackets, which should have been a perpetual money machine for the family, were either lost to rival factions, dismantled by law enforcement, or rendered toxic by the sheer notoriety Scarfo brought to them. The constant warfare and the intense scrutiny scared away legitimate business partners and made the skim operations untenable. The focus on murder diverted energy and resources from revenue-generating activities. By the time Scarfo was imprisoned, the family's treasury was depleted, its income stream severed, and its ability to corrupt politicians and police severely damaged by the glaring spotlight he had attracted. He left the family bankrupt in every sense, morally, operationally, and financially. The physical landmarks of his reign tell their own silent story. The social club at 923 South 9th Street, the candy store, is gone, just another address in a changing neighborhood. The Scarf Incorporated restaurant in Atlantic City has long since vanished, the city's revival eventually moving past its need for that kind of brutal governance. These places now exist only in crime scene photographs and court transcripts, memorials to a failed state. And then there are the descendants, the living legacy. For the children and grandchildren of men like Salvie Testa or Frank Nerduxi, the name Scarfo is a synonym for stolen fathers and lifelong grief. For his own grandson, the son of Philip Leonetti, it is the root of a fractured identity and a childhood spent in hiding. For Nicky Jr., it is the inheritance of a life sentence, the burden of a name that doomed him to follow his father's path into a concrete cell. Scarfo's bloodline, which he sought to empower, is his final and most tragic casualty, a dynasty that begins and ends behind bars. In the annals of organized crime, other bosses were more powerful, like John Gotti, or more insidiously influential, like Carlo Gambino. But no boss was more destructively toxic to his own organization than little Nicky Scarfo. He is not remembered with the twisted glamour of a Gotti, but with a shudder, as a case study in catastrophic leadership. His story is the antithesis of the romanticized gangster myth. It is a clinical portrait of how paranoia, untethered from strategic purpose, becomes a self-immolating force. He proved that absolute fear can seize power, but it cannot hold it, for it inevitably manufactures the instruments of its own destruction from the flesh of its most loyal servants. The Philadelphia Mafia never recovered its former stature. It was permanently relegated to a secondary, weakened player, a direct result of the 5'5" dictator who burned down his own kingdom to feel its warmth for a few fleeting, bloody years. His most enduring monument is the silence that followed the gunfire, not the silence of omerta, but the silence of a graveyard, both literal and organizational, that he filled with the ghosts of his own making. The final act of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo's life was a drawn-out, solitary coda, a masterclass in irrelevance and diminishing returns that stood in stark, pathetic contrast to the explosive fury of his prime. After the final convictions in the First Plus financial case, which sealed his son's fate and added another layer of concrete to his own eternal confinement, Scarfo receded from the headlines, becoming a spectral figure in the federal prison system. He was transferred from one high-security facility to another, a ghost in the machine, his notoriety now just a line in a corrections officer's briefing file. The man who once held the life of a city in his palm now held nothing but the hours, days, and years, each one identical to the last in its sterile, controlled emptiness. His health, predictably, began to fail. The years of stress, the prison diet, the lack of freedom, and the sheer weight of his own poisonous history took their toll on his small, once tense frame. He suffered from cardiovascular problems, the physical manifestation of a heart that had only ever beat for power and vengeance. The rumors and sporadic legal filings that trickled out of the prison system spoke of a man who was increasingly frail, a shadow of the ferocious dictator who had once made hardened killers tremble. Yet, by all accounts, his mindset never underwent a redemption. There was no deathbed confession, no moment of clarity where he expressed remorse for the dozens of lives he had ended or the countless more he had shattered. The paranoia and the defiant, toxic pride that defined him remained his only constants, his final companions in a cell that was his world. He would never admit error, for to do so would be to invalidate the only thing that ever gave his life meaning, his authority, bought with blood. He died as he lived, utterly convinced of his own righteousness within his own distorted moral framework, a king in his own mind even as his body betrayed him in a prison infirmary. On January 13, 2017, at the age of 87, Nicodemo Scarfo died in a federal medical center in North Carolina. The official cause was listed as natural causes, but in a deeper sense, he had died the moment the cell door first clanged shut behind him decades earlier. The news of his death was met not with mourning in the underworld, but with a profound, weary silence. There were no grandiose mob funerals, no procession of black Cadillacs, no eulogies from powerful men. The family he had led was a broken remnant, and the New York families wanted no association with his toxic legacy. His passing was a footnote in the news cycle, a final, blunt confirmation of a truth long evident. The era he represented was not just over, but discredited, a failed model of criminal governance. His body was claimed, and he was buried in a private ceremony, the location undisclosed to prevent desecration. It was a lonely, secretive end for a man who craved attention and fear, an irony he would have despised. In death, he was granted the obscurity he fought against his entire life. The story, however, does not end with his burial. The true epilogue to the Scarfo saga is written in the ongoing lives of those he touched and the indelible lessons his reign imprinted on the fabric of American crime. For law enforcement, Scarfo became the ultimate textbook example. The success of the RICO prosecutions against him and the cascade of high-level cooperators he created validated new strategies for dismantling organized crime. Prosecutors learned that a violent, paranoid boss was his own worst enemy, a factory producing witnesses. The FBI's playbook was refined using the Philadelphia case as a core study. For the Mafia nationally, Scarfo's name is uttered as a warning, a synonym for how not to lead. He is the ghost at every meeting, a cautionary tale that reminds even the most ruthless captains that unchecked violence against one's own is an organizational suicide pill. His legacy permanently altered the calculus of power, making bosses more cautious, more aware that their underlings are potential witnesses, not just loyal soldiers. This has led to a quieter, more corporate, and far less violent mafia, one that has learned, at terrible cost, from Scarfo's catastrophic example. And for us, the observers of this dark history, the tale of Little Nicky is not one of glamour or anti-hero worship. It is a stark, unflinching look at the pure essence of sociopathic ambition stripped of any romantic filter. It shows us that the ultimate destination of a path built solely on fear and blood is not a throne, but a solitary confinement cell. It demonstrates how paranoia, when fed, does not protect power. It isolates it, strangles it, and leaves it utterly alone. Scarfo sought to build an empire that would last generations, but he could not build anything that required trust, loyalty, or love, the very mortar of any lasting institution, legitimate or illicit. He was a force of pure destruction. And in the end, the most complete and total ruin was his own. His story, in its entirety, serves as a grim reminder of the self-consuming nature of absolute tyranny and the inevitable collapse that awaits when a leader confuses terror for strength and murder for management. The echo of the gunshots has faded, the social clubs are closed, but the chilling lesson remains, forever etched in the annals of true crime. The most dangerous man is often the one who cannot see that the violence he sows will one day be the harvest he reaps, alone and forgotten, in a prison far from home. This has been the complete, unvarnished story of Little Nicky Scarfo, a narrative pieced together from the fragments of history, trial testimony, and the courage of those who finally spoke out. If this journey into the heart of a criminal empire and the mind of its doomed architect held your attention, if you believe that understanding these dark chapters is crucial, then your engagement is vital. Please, help us continue to bring these comprehensive, meticulously researched stories to light. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the truths that history hides. Like this video to support our work, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson from Scarfo's reign stands out most to you? Your interaction ensures that these important, cautionary tales are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and for seeking the truth, no matter how dark it may be.